Okay, let's just dive right into this. What really happens to your nervous system when you take a drink? Now, it's a question most of us probably think we know the answer to, right? A little relaxation, maybe your inhibitions drop a bit. But what if I told you that beneath that initial feeling of relief, there is a literal microscopic war being waged inside your body? Today, we're going to embark on a pretty wild cinematic journey into the hidden biological reality of alcohol consumption. We're zooming all the way down into the deepest mechanisms of human biology to uncover a fascinating and, frankly, a bit terrifying story of chemical hijacking and systemic collapse. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to completely deconstruct exactly how alcohol rewires the brain, hijacks your immune system, and systematically dismantles your physiological equilibrium. We're going to look at the precise molecular and epigenetic triggers that push a nervous system from, casual adaptation straight into a full-blown state of allostatic collapse. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the acute alcohol illusion, and that micro-level synaptic shift. So, to truly understand that acute illusion of relaxation you get when alcohol first hits the brain, we have to start at the microscopic level of the synapse. Think of it like this. Alcohol basically slams on your brain's neurological brakes while simultaneously cutting the engine. Over on the GABA side, that's your brakes, alcohol acts as an allosteric modulator. It actually binds to a specific pocket on the receptor and physically forces the channel to stay open way longer than it should. This floods the neuron with negatively charged chloride ions, heavily suppressing neuronal firing. Then, on the flip side, we have the NMDA receptor, which is basically the gas pedal. It usually binds glutamate to stimulate the brain. Well, alcohol actually inhibits the gating of this receptor, blocking excitatory signals. So you've got this massive inhibition combined with suppressed excitation, and that right there is the chemical formula for acute intoxication, losing your motor coordination, and that fleeting feeling of stress relief. But here's the crazy part. Alcohol's reach goes way deeper than just cell surface receptors. It literally reaches right into your DNA. During this acute phase, it temporarily opens up the chromatin structure in the brain's emotional center, the amygdala. How? By inhibiting these specific enzymes called histone deacetylases, or HDHCs. By essentially forcing the chromatin open, the brain temporarily releases a massive surge of neuroplasticity factors, most notably brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. This rapid epigenetic uncoiling creates that warm, transient feeling of relaxation and sociability. But as we'll see, it's a total illusion of biological harmony. Which brings us to Section 2, the dark side of addiction, epigenetic rewiring and stress loops. Now, as drinking becomes chronic, the brain desperately tries to adapt to this constant chemical disruption. And this is what leads us straight into the tragic dark side of addiction. Let's talk about a crucial concept here called allostatic load. See, our nervous system is designed for homeostasis, right? A nice, stable baseline. But chronic alcohol forces the system to constantly adapt, creating a totally new, highly stressed baseline known as allostasis. The biological irony here is just devastating. To counter the constant suppression from the alcohol, the brain eventually downregulates its GABA receptors and heavily upregulates those excitatory NMDA receptors. So, what happens when the alcohol is suddenly removed? The brain is left with practically no brakes and a gas pedal that is completely stuck to the floor. This causes severe hyperexcitability, anxiety, and autonomic panic. At this point, the user isn't drinking for a reward anymore. They are literally drinking just to survive the intense negative reinforcement of their own adapted neurochemistry. And this systemic stress builds up at the genetic level too. The epigenome actually completely reverses course during withdrawal. Remember those HDC enzymes that got inhibited during the acute phase? Well, during withdrawal, they come roaring back. HDC activity aggressively increases, and that violently condenses the chromogene structure in the amygdala. This tightly packed DNA completely silences the exact same neuroplasticity genes, like BDNF and neuropeptide Y, that previously gave you relief. The physical structure of the neurons literally starts to shrink as dendritic spine density drops, which basically locks the amygdala into this chronic, negative affective state characterized by deep, deep anxiety and a relentless susceptibility to stress. Let's move to Section 3, the gut-brain axis hijack, the systemic collapse. So to truly grasp the massive scale of this allostatic collapse, we actually have to zoom out from the brain for a second and look at a surprisingly powerful driver of neuroinflammation, your gut microbiome. This step-by-step mechanism is fascinating because it shows exactly how intestinal permeability turns your gut into a dangerous source of systemic inflammation. It all starts down in the gut lining. Alcohol directly destroys the tight junctions that literally hold our intestinal walls together. And at the exact same time, it radically alters your microbial ecosystem, allowing harmful bacteria to just flourish. These bad bacteria start shedding highly toxic outer membrane molecules called lipopolysaccharides, or LPS. Because the gut wall is now compromised, these endotoxins leak directly into your bloodstream, a condition known as endotoxemia. And from there, it is a straight shot right to the central nervous system. You can really see the catastrophic shift in the microbiome ecosystem right here. On the one hand, we get this massive spike in harmful bacteria like E. coli and proteobacteria. These are the exact guys responsible for flooding your system with those LPS endotoxins. But the true tragedy is what's happening on the other side. Alcohol absolutely wipes out beneficial bacteria, particularly bifidobacterium and fecal bacterium. And why does that matter? Because these are the specific microbes responsible for producing short-chain fatty acids, or SCFAs. Normally, SCFAs cross the blood-brain barrier and act like a protective shield for the brain's structural integrity, keeping inflammation at bay. When you lose those SCFAs, you're essentially stripping away your brain's primary metabolic armor. Which brings us to Section 4, microglia and neuroinflammation, immune sentinels on overdrive. Okay, so once these gut-derived endotoxins finally reach the central nervous system, they collide head-on with the brain's primary immune cells, the microglia. This quote really nails it. When that invading LPS from your gut gets up into the brain, it docks directly onto these TLR4 receptors found on the microglia. This essentially whips the microglia into a hyperactive, pro-inflammatory frenzy. They activate the NF-kappa B signaling pathway and just start pouring out neurotoxic cytokines like TNF-alpha and interleukin-1 beta. So instead of protecting the brain like they're supposed to, these overactivated immune sentinels start ravaging local, perfectly healthy neurons. It's biological friendly fire. And if we map out this collateral neuroinflammation, it causes staggering, highly localized damage. Let's break this down. Up in the prefrontal cortex, that TLR4 activation and subsequent gray matter loss lead directly to impaired decision-making and executive dysfunction. If we move down into the hippocampus, we see that microglial inflammation literally drives synaptic necrosis, basically destroying memory formation. Over in the central amygdala, like we talked about earlier, that condensed chromatin locks the brain into a state of chronic anxiety. And crucially, down in the hypothalamus, inflammatory cytokines trigger the overexpression of CRH neurons, which relentlessly activates the HPA axis, just flooding your entire body with systemic stress hormones. It is quite literally a complete, multi-regional systemic collapse. Let's look at Section 5, breaching the blood-brain barrier, the fortress falls. Now, all of this begs a really important question. How do these peripheral toxins physically bypass the brain's ultimate defense system in the very first place? Normally, your brain is protected by the blood-brain barrier. It's this highly selective filter made of tightly woven endothelial cells. But chronic alcohol literally melts the mortar of the brain's fortress walls. Through the activation of the protein kinase C-alpha, or PKC-alpha signaling pathway, alcohol actively downregulates those tight junction proteins. It just dissolves the structural integrity of the microvasculature. The fortress walls fall, leaving the brain utterly exposed to the chaotic, highly inflammatory environment of the peripheral bloodstream. And the consequences of this barrier collapse, they are catastrophic. This total systemic collapse unites the peripheral immune system with the central nervous system in this tragic, accelerating feedback loop. Not only are systemic inflammatory factors pouring in to prime those microglia, but peripheral T cells, which absolutely should never be inside the brain, begin to infiltrate the central nervous system. This drastically accelerates macrostructural neurodegeneration. It even puts individuals at an incredibly high risk for severe demyelinating conditions, where the protective sheath around nerve fibers is literally destroyed, leading to devastating outcomes like Marchi-Fava Bignami disease. Okay, take a breath. Despite this pretty dark reality, the research actually points us toward an incredibly exciting frontier of recovery. Because the damage is so heavily mediated by the gut-brain axis, new science is intensely focusing on healing the microbiome to quiet down that central neuroinflammation. Specific natural compounds, particularly polysaccharides with very specific beta-glucan branches, alongside polyphenols and saponins, are showing immense promise here. By acting as targeted prebiotics, they can actually restore the abundance of those beneficial SCFA-producing bacteria we lost. If we can heal that gut wall and restore those protective short-chain fatty acids, we can potentially halt the microglial frenzy and actually begin to reverse the cognitive and epigenetic damage. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. For decades, we have viewed alcoholism strictly as a disease of brain chemistry, or worse, just willpower. But as we've seen today, it's really a systemic collapse driven heavily by the gut and the immune system.
As we continue to uncover exactly how deeply the gut-immune-brain axis controls addiction, will the future of treating alcoholism focus less on targeting the brain directly and maybe a lot more on healing the microbiome? It completely shifts our perspective on what it really takes to regulate our nervous system. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and always keep questioning the deep biology behind our behaviors.